Great, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Our next presenter this morning is Kyle Neidig, and he is with Mitsubishi Hitachi Power Systems America, and he is going to be presenting on mercury oxidation in the SCR layer-by-layer performance, which means I'm going to get another science lesson, which is always great, because this is the stuff that I need to learn more about. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Todd.
You bet.
So as Todd said, I'm going to be talking more on the technical side, and as opposed to some of these other presentations we've heard over the time. Let me see if this. Can I use a? Can anyone see the laser pointer up there? I'm probably going to try and point some things out, so hopefully everyone can see. I'm going to focus my presentation on talking about using an SCR as part of your MATS compliance strategy. We've done quite a bit of testing both in the lab and in the field, so I'm going to share some of those results with you and then make an attempt of what do these results mean for building a strategy and optimizing the use of your SCR and existing controls equipment that are already in place on many units to comply with the MATS rule for mercury in specific. So as Todd mentioned, we're now Mitsubishi Hitachi Power Systems, so I feel I owe everyone an explanation. If you haven't heard already, as of February 1st, MHI and Hitachi Limited merged their thermal power businesses globally. The new company name is Mitsubishi Hitachi Power Systems, so that we're part of the Americas arm of that business. So just real quick, anybody have any idea how many coal-fired units are in the U.S. that have SCRs? Any idea? It's actually much lower than that on a percentage basis. There's probably somewhere over 1,000 units out there. Only 300 have SCRs currently. But whenever we look at those 300 units, the majority of those also have FGDs in place already. So whenever you look at the oxidation of mercury that takes place across the SCR, most of those units are also able to capture that oxidized mercury in the downstream scrubber. So a lot of units out there are already getting great mercury co-benefits, we call it, from the SCR and FGD. So I'm just going to focus a little bit on how can we optimize that process that's already naturally occurring in our plants. So another quick question, you know, of those 300 units that are equipped with SCRs, what do you think the average size of those units are? Well, it's, if I can get it to come up, it's about 550 megawatts would be the average size of those units. So these are the larger units. They're already equipped with SCRs. Most of them have FGDs. They're probably the future of our coal-fired generation base in the U.S. So it makes a lot of sense to optimize and try and keep costs low on these units and comply with the rules. Oops, I'm bouncing ahead a little bit. All right, so if we just look at the mercury removal process as we go across a typical coal-fired power plant, you can see the mercury comes into the plant in the coal in the elemental form. You get some mercury oxidation that takes place throughout the combustion process, but the majority of the oxidation actually takes place as you go, the flue gas passes across the catalyst. Oxidized mercury, much easier, much cheaper to take out, as I said before, especially if your unit also has an FGD. So in theory, you can get nearly 100% of the oxidized mercury removed in an FGD as long as you've got good chemistry there and you've got good, you're avoiding re-emission basically. So what are you left with at the stack? Well, you're left with basically anything you weren't able to oxidize. And that's why oxidation in the SCR is such an important factor. So before I get too far ahead of myself, I just want to point out, you know, this is, we do a little play on words. We call it our track record. I'm going to talk specifically about the Mitsubishi Hitachi track type catalyst. It's an advanced catalyst for mercury oxidation. We now have 19 layers commercially operating of this product. 10 more layers that are planned to be installed over the next year. So this is a commercially available, commercially proven product, and it's being accepted by the industry as a plan and an approach to optimize your mercury emission reductions. Well, there we go. So what are some of the main parameters that impact mercury oxidation in the SCR? There's 5 main ones that I'm going to talk about. That being ammonia to NOx ratio. That's key. As you have more ammonia, typically it's harder to oxidize mercury. They go after the same active sites on the catalyst, and catalyst was originally designed for NOx. That's the dominating reaction that wants to occur. The catalyst, as it ages and deactivates, it's no different than NOx. The mercury oxidation rate also deactivates and ages as the catalyst has been exposed to flue gas over time. Halogen concentration is a big one. you got to have halogens. It's the equivalent of your ammonia in the NOx reduction reaction. You use the halogens that are present in the fuel or added in the combustion process or downstream of that somewhere. But those are what are used with the catalyst to combine with the mercury to oxidize it. Temperature is another big one in the SCR. In general, the higher the temperature, the less mercury oxidation you're going to be able to get. Lower temperatures are definitely much more prone to oxidizing mercury. And another big thing that we're starting to learn more about, you know, I should have said earlier, but we're constantly learning about what impacts mercury oxidation in the SCR. One of the things that we're more focused on now more than ever before is what is your elemental to total mercury ratio in the SCR? Has a huge impact. That last little bit of elemental mercury is much harder to get than whenever you have a very high ratio of elemental mercury. So the two that are shaded in blue there are the layer-specific parameters. As you go through your SCR, your ammonia to NOx ratio is going to change with every layer of catalyst, and you're going to oxidize some mercury with every layer of catalyst. So now your ratio of elemental to total mercury is going to be different for every layer of catalyst. So those are the two that I'm going to focus mostly on when we look at trying to build this strategy and what is the best location for getting mercury oxidation in your SCR. So just real quick, I'll hit on the deactivation rate. In general, the deactivation rate of the mercury activity of catalyst is very much in line with the deactivation rate of the NOx reduction activity. So whenever you look at those two things, you can probably still work on a similar catalyst management plan as what you were using in the past. This slide talks about temperature on the left-hand side and then the halogen or HCl concentration on the right-hand side. We compared, you know, our track catalyst to conventional catalyst. Track in the blue, conventional in the dotted pink line, I suppose. And you can see for all temperature ranges, track catalyst has the ability to oxidize more mercury. And it has a similar trend. You know, the higher the temperatures, you're going to get slightly reduced mercury oxidation compared to the lower temperatures. On the halogen side of things, the only point at which the two catalyst types are equal is whenever no halogens are present at all. And that's because really, in theory, you need the halogens, as I said before, to get any mercury oxidation. Be the equivalent of turning off your ammonia. You're not going to get any NOx reduction. So without the presence of halogens, you won't be able to oxidize mercury. But you can see, you know, with any level of HCl or any other halogen present in the flue gas, the mercury oxidation rate across the track catalyst is significantly higher than the conventional catalyst. So before I get into the layer specifics, I want to discuss a little bit of the testing background and how some of these layer specifics were determined. So we do mercury oxidation testing in a lab, small scale. It's similar to a bench scale test that is very commonly used on catalyst. But we're using a lab scale because we don't want to inject mercury in the bench. It causes all kinds of different problems that we just, quite honestly, I don't think anyone is doing yet. I know people are looking at it, but no one is doing it yet. So everyone that's testing in the lab with mercury right now is doing it on this small scale lab testing. I don't want to go through the details of the test. The only thing I want to point out down here at the bottom of the screen is the note. You know, in the lab, you cannot completely replicate all the different parameters and all the different things that are happening in the plant. So what we do is we're testing in the lab. We're implementing a set of correction procedures and correction curves to try and predict what the performance is in the plant based on that. And over the years and over our testing and our experience in comparing field results compared to lab results, we've been able to dial in on this fairly well. But as I said, there's always still things you're learning. There's things such as ash that are present in the field that you really can't account for, and what impact does that have? It's very difficult to determine. So we're learning and we're getting better every time we do a test, but we're still not 100% accurate in being able to predict the performance in the field with a lab test. Let me get the... Uh-oh. Okay, so as I said, this is just a general test that we did, kind of verifying what we're doing in the lab and correcting those results to what the field test is. We did test 1 and test 2 back in 2010, very good correlation, and then test 3, we came back to the same plant, same location, did the test again 2011 and got very good correlation again, as you can see. So I think we're very close to getting accurate results based on field, lab measurements, but you know, I just can't say and 100% certainty that every plant is operating the same. There's always differences in every plant. So if we look at layer-specific impacts, we look at two different scenarios, eastern bituminous case and PRB case. That's what they're calling them. Really, anytime from here on in the rest of the presentation, whenever I say eastern bituminous, you can replace that with a higher or moderately halogenated fuel, or whenever I say PRB, I'm talking a lower halogen fuel. So you can see for this, we looked at, as I mentioned before, the ammonia has a big impact, so we looked at 90% NOx reduction, so you've got a large amount of ammonia. In an eastern bituminous plant, we looked at what general rule of thumb, about 20% of mercury is already oxidized entering the SCR. On the PRB, or the lower halogen fuel side, about 10%. And then the HCl is the big one. We used what we feel is a typical halogen level for eastern bituminous or a medium to higher halogen fuel. And then the lower halogen fuel, PRB style 5 ppm. So what are the results? So if we look at that and we just look at the ammonia to NOx ratio and what impact it has on mercury oxidation, you can see track in the red up here on the top and the conventional catalyst in the blue. So there's a little bit of an impact. As we said, the higher concentrations of ammonia reduce the ability to oxidize mercury, and that was consistently seen. But what happens whenever we introduce on top of this and we intermingle the concept of the ratio of elemental to total mercury in the SCR? So this next slide takes a look at that. I think I've got maybe in just general where your upper layers and lower layers in your SCR relative on this graph. So this next takes a look at what the impact is whenever you've got over here. This is it's hard to read, I'm sure, for some in the back, but this is the percentage of the available elemental mercury that can be oxidized across one layer of catalyst, starting at 0 all the way up to 90% on the scale. And then this is the ratio of elemental to total mercury at the inlet of that layer of catalyst. So if we look at that, it's a huge impact to what we thought we knew from layer by layer results based on just the ammonia impact. So if we look at this typical eastern bituminous plant, our upper layer is somewhere, in that 30% elemental or more remaining. Lower layers typically less than 30% elemental remains. So what's the impact and the difference between a track or an advanced catalyst specifically designed for mercury oxidation and a conventional catalyst? Well, it's about 2 to 3 times more mercury oxidation in your upper layers, and it's about 5 to 10 times more mercury oxidation in your lower layers, where that mercury becomes very hard to go after and get, where there's not as much elemental left to go after. So what's the impact of this? What does it mean? Well, just from this graph, it's still hard to tell. You've got a lot more elemental mercury in your upper layers, so maybe it's better to put an advanced catalyst in your upper layer. But you get more benefit in the lower layers relative to a conventional layer. So where's the balancing act? So what we did was we looked at 6 different cases. We looked at a base case where you use 4 layers, all conventional catalyst. And then we looked at 4 more cases where you put a layer of advanced catalyst in either the first, the second, the third, or the 4th layer. And then we looked at a 6th scenario where you used advanced catalyst in all layers. So you can see for this plant, the conditions that I laid out earlier, they're getting about 83% mercury oxidation just with conventional catalyst. So that's pretty good. That's not too bad. If they were to put a track layer in the first layer, they get up to 90%. Second layer, similar, about the 90%. Third layer, we see a little bit of a benefit, 93%. Now in the 4th layer, we're up to 95%. So if we look at that, and then, another thing to point out is in this last layer, only 96%. So does it even make sense on a higher halogen fuel to go to advanced catalyst in all layers? Maybe not, probably not really. So if we look at that, first or second layer, you're running your catalyst management plan, it's time to replace a layer of catalyst, but you're due to replace your first or second layer. It's not a bad location for track, it's just there's other options out there that are better. So the 3rd or 4th layer is more ideal location for the track. This is all based on lab testing. There's errors in the measurements and everything. So who's to say there's a big difference between 93 and 95% in this? It's tough to say, right? So I think 3rd or 4th layer are both really good locations to put in advanced catalyst. As I said before, if you look at the bottom layer, there's really not much benefit to putting in all 4 layers. So if we look at this, what impact does this have on actual mercury emissions at the stack? If you look at 83% mercury oxidation compared to 95% mercury oxidation in your SCR, and you're assuming a good capture efficiency in the FGD, you're actually looking at a 70% reduction in the stack mercury emissions at this plant. So it doesn't seem like a lot when you're looking at percentages, but when you're looking at what actually makes it to the stack, it's a huge impact. So what can we take away from this on the higher halogen fuel side? Really, an advanced catalyst installed anywhere is going to give you some benefit, but if you have your choice, it's probably better to install it in the lower layers. So same thing for the lower halogen fuel. I'll run through this a little bit quicker. It's the same analysis, only difference is the halogen concentration is much lower. So again, very similar relationship on the ammonia to NOx molar ratio. Upper layers, again, a little bit less compared to lower layers. Until we factor in the impact of the, if I can get to it, the mercury speciation. You can go to the next slide. There we go. So again, now the curve looks completely different, you know, after we implement in the concept of this different molar ratios of, different ratios of elemental to total mercury. And again, we look at our upper layers compared to our lower layers and the differences between the advanced catalyst. We're getting about 3 to 4 times more mercury oxidation activity in the upper layers and maybe 5 to 8 times more in the lower layers. So again, what does that mean? Well, we're looking at roughly 38% mercury oxidation with 4 layers of conventional catalyst, boosting it up to 51 when track is in the first layer. When track is in the second layer, it's boosted up to 53, 56 in the third layer, and 59 in the fourth layer. But if you look here, you know, you can go, if you get to all track eventually, right? You know, no one's probably going to go out and say, I just want to take all my current catalyst out and put in track. But over the years, as you're replacing catalyst, maybe every couple years, eventually you could get to a point where you might have all track. And we look at roughly 80% mercury oxidation at that point. So what can we say? We can say actually going from 38 to 51%, that's a pretty good location for track. That's not too bad at all. In the lower layers, it's even a better location. But what's the ideal scenario here? The ideal scenario is installing track eventually to a point where you get as much of it in the box as you can, because you're going to get a noticeable benefit every time you put another layer in. So if we were to look at this again, you know, what it means at the stack, if we went from 38% mercury oxidation in our SCR to 80% mercury oxidation in our SCR, we're looking at roughly a 68% reduction in the stack mercury emissions. So, you know, in conclusion, what do we say for PRB? We can say really any layer is a good layer to install track, and the more track you have installed, the more benefit you're going to see on mercury. So, this just talks in concept again, you know, boosting your oxidized mercury percentage by a little bit always ends up in reduced emissions at the stack, as you know, assuming you're getting good removal efficiency across the FGD. So a little bit on full-scale results now. We've done a couple tests. We haven't been able to do as much testing or as elaborate testing as we've been able to do in the lab, just because of the cost implications associated with doing the mercury testing on the full-scale side. So this is one unit, bituminous fuel, so higher chlorine in the fuel. You can see the fuel range from about 43 to 120 ppm in the fuel. This unit, they wanted to install the lower layer catalyst to be their advanced track catalyst, so they actually moved this bottom layer up to the top, and then in the empty layer in the bottom installed track. So they had the same three catalyst layers that they had before, and just basically added a layer of track catalyst in the bottom. And here's the results. We measured at the inlet of the SCR, after the first 3 layers, and then at the outlet of the SCR. And at the inlet of the SCR, the average, we're in that 10 to 15% mercury oxidation range. After the first 3 layers, we're in that 40, 50% range. And then we're up here close to 75% at the end. So whenever you look at that and what was achieved and oxidized across 1 layer of the track catalyst compared to 3 layers of a conventional catalyst, the actual activity ratio of track was close to 5 times higher than the conventional. And that's in line with what we were able to predict in the lab tests that we did. Similar, this is now for PRB unit. We actually have 3 units we studied in this. We've got Unit 1 and Unit 2 that have 3 layers of conventional catalyst, 1 layer of track, and Unit 4, which has 4 layers of just conventional catalyst. Oops, I skipped ahead. So if we look at that, you know, here's the speciated mercury test results. But if you look here, you know, at the SCR inlet on all 3 units, you're less than 5% mercury oxidation. On the 2 units that have track, you're somewhere in that 40 to 50% mercury oxidation at the outlet of the air heater. And on the unit that didn't have track, you're somewhere in that 10 to 15% range. So again, you can see a significant benefit, about 3 times more mercury oxidation with that last layer being track compared to not having the last layer be conventional catalyst. So we took this and said, okay, so what does all this mean? You know, it's good, we want to oxidize mercury, but financially and for compliance with MATS, what's the impact? So I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'll run through these numbers fairly quickly here. We looked at really 4 cases. We looked at, again, our eastern bituminous case with an ESP. We looked at an eastern bituminous case with a fabric filter. We looked at a PRB case with an ESP and a PRB case with a fabric filter. And we compared using catalyst, conventional versus an advanced catalyst in those units to what you needed to do if you were going to trim with activated carbon to get you to compliance with MATS. So whenever we looked at that, this happens to be the bituminous case, the eastern bituminous case with no fabric filters, ESP. So whenever we looked at that, and I believe this is based on a 3 layers of catalyst analysis, an SCR that had 3 layers in it. If they were looking at all 3 layers being non-track catalyst, they were going to oxidize close to 88% at this unit. Assuming about 95% removal efficiency in the FGD of that oxidized mercury, now they're removing about 83% of the total mercury that was coming into the plant. It gets them close to MATS compliance, but not quite there. It's a bituminous fuel. You've got some SO3 there in the flue gas, so activated carbon consumption is going to be a little bit higher as it goes after the SO3 first. They were looking at having to inject about 4 pounds per million actual cubic feet of activated carbon to trim to get them into MATS compliance. Activated carbon costs at a 500 megawatt plant, roughly $4 million a year for them. So over an 8-year period, they were looking at a MATS compliance cost of somewhere in that $30–35 million range. Whenever they implemented track catalyst, and these were based on what we were able to perform, how we were able to perform through the entire guarantee period, or for basically 16,000 hours until they would be up for another catalyst action anyway, based in the normal catalyst management plan. And whenever we look at that, we were able to oxidize 95% of the mercury in this unit, greater than 90% removal inherent after you go downstream of the FGD to the stack. And the differential cost of track catalyst is nothing, essentially, in compared to what they were going to have to spend in activated carbon costs. So implementing a strategy in your SCR and focusing on the pieces of equipment that are already there saved this plant over 8 years roughly $35 million. We did the same thing with fabric filter. I'm not going to run through it in a lot of detail. The only difference is the activated carbon usage rates are much lower because you get a much better treatment time on the bags. There we go. So you can see instead of the 4 pounds, they're roughly at a half a pound per million actual cubic feet. But still 8 years, roughly $4 million compared to about $1 million. So roughly $3 million in savings on a unit, even with the bag house. If we look at the PRB case, this is a little bit jumbled just because it looks at the additional benefits as you go from 1 layer after for about 2 years, and then you need another layer of catalyst and your mercury oxidation rate increases. But the general story here again is that at the less you oxidize in the SCR, the more activated carbon you're going to have to use as trim to get you into MATS compliance. So whenever we look at it, best case scenario again is after these 8 years, we use a kind of a weighted average of what they were going to have to use on activated carbon throughout that period as they're transitioning from a conventional catalyst to an advanced mercury catalyst. And we're looking at $44 million in compliance for MATS compared to roughly $24 million, so about a $20 million savings. And same thing with the fabric filter. Again, the only thing that's changed is the injection rates and the usage efficiency of the activated carbon. And now you're looking at roughly from $6 million to somewhere $3.5 million. So right in that $2 to $3 million savings range. So there's a lot to be said about implementing a practice with your SCR that, a lot of people out there, a lot of people sitting in this room already have units with SCRs and FGDs, and optimizing your approach with those existing pieces of equipment without question is going to save money in the cost burden of complying with the MATS rule. So I believe that's all I have. If there's time for questions or anyone has anyone, I'd be happy to attempt to answer.
There is time for questions. So if there are any questions from the floor? One up here. Hold on, he'll give you a mic.
Thank you. So Kyle, can you talk a little bit about the SO2 to SO3 conversion rate of track versus conventional, or the conventional low SO2 to SO3 catalysts?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is what happens to the conversion rate of SO2 to SO3 whenever you use the advanced track catalyst. And in general, the only difference with the track catalyst is its ability to oxidize more mercury. So for the majority of applications and operating conditions that exist out there, we can get the same SO2 to SO3 conversion rate, same NOx performance activity with track catalyst. The only difference is we get that about 2 to 3 times higher activity ratio on the mercury side.
Any other questions?
All right, thanks for your time, guys.